There's a strange misconception in modern culture that growth must be loud, that success must be broadcast, and that every move should be shared. But the truth is, real progress happens in silence. When you focus on yourself, truly focus, you begin to understand the architecture of your mind. You stop outsourcing your identity to validation, and instead start anchoring your energy in behavior and biology. Silence isn't weakness, it's power under control. In fact, staying silent sharpens your perception. It allows your prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making and focus, to strengthen through what we call indirected attention. When you reduce distractions, both external and internal, you increase neural efficiency. Focusing on yourself also reclaims something most people lose early: agency. You begin to control your inputs, what you watch, what you listen to, and who you let shape your nervous system. And when you stay silent, you train another system, impulse control. This isn't about suppressing expression, it's about timing it. Strategic silence creates anticipation, not confusion. You conserve cognitive energy and spend it on things that actually compound: learning, skill building, health, and meaningful work. In a world that rewards noise, become a master of clarity. Focus on yourself, stay silent, let your results make the noise. Silence, as simple as it seems, has a profound physiological effect on the brain. When you remove external auditory input, background chatter, media noise, even casual conversation, you allow the auditory cortex to downregulate, which in turn frees up cognitive resources for higher order functions like reflection, analysis, and creative problem solving. In neuroscience, we often talk about the default mode network, a set of brain regions that becomes active during rest or introspective thinking. Silence activates this network, encouraging internal exploration, self-assessment, and long-range planning. In environments where noise is constant, the brain enters a state of vigilance, always scanning, always decoding. This taxes the nervous system and limits the brain's ability to enter deep, restorative states of focus. Silence acts as a reset. It reduces the activation of the amygdala, lowering anxiety and enabling more balanced signaling between the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex. This balance is critical for maintaining clarity under pressure and making rational, forward-thinking decisions. Furthermore, studies show that even brief periods of silence between auditory stimuli can enhance sensory processing and memory consolidation. The brain doesn't just use silence as a break, it uses it as an opportunity to integrate, clean up, and rewire. It's during these quiet moments that the brain refines connections, filters out irrelevant noise, literally and metaphorically, and primes itself for sharper attention and more efficient learning. So, silence isn't the absence of input. It's a signal in itself, one that tells the brain it's time to recalibrate, to deepen awareness, and to prepare for higher cognitive engagement. It's a tool that enhances mental clarity not by adding more, but by deliberately taking less. When you deliberately direct attention toward your own behaviors, thoughts, and long-term goals, you're engaging circuits within the prefrontal cortex, specifically areas involved in executive function, such as the dorsolateral and ventromedial prefrontal regions. These areas govern planning, impulse control, future projection, and behavioral inhibition. In neuroscience, we know that circuits that are used repeatedly become more efficient and even grow in density and connectivity through a process known as experience-dependent plasticity. So when you shift focus inward, not in a ruminative or self-critical way, but with structured reflection and intentional goal setting, you're essentially training the prefrontal cortex to take the lead over more reactive systems in the brain, like the limbic system. This shift has major implications. It enables you to respond to challenges with calculated actions instead of reflexive ones. It improves your ability to delay gratification, prioritize what matters, and resist distractions that hijack attention. Focusing on yourself in a consistent and organized way, journaling, planning, assessing progress, even visualizing future outcomes, builds prefrontal engagement. Over time, this translates to greater mental clarity, improved emotional regulation, and an increased capacity for long-term thinking. What's powerful is that this isn't just psychological, it's structural. Brain imaging studies show measurable changes in prefrontal volume and connectivity in individuals who engage in regular self-directed practices. That's how focus on the self becomes a tool for upgrading cognitive control. You're not just thinking better, you're literally reshaping the hardware that governs how you think. When external input is reduced, whether that's from social media, constant conversation, or even passive background noise, Your brain shifts from a reactive mode to a more deliberate, self-regulated state. This transition is neurobiologically significant because the brain, particularly the prefrontal cortex, can only handle a limited bandwidth of attentional resources. When those resources are constantly being diverted to processing external stimuli, especially those that are emotionally or socially charged, the circuits responsible for complex decision-making become overloaded. This overload compromises your ability to weigh long-term consequences, to assess options objectively, and to maintain internal alignment with your goals and values. Instead, you start making reactive choices, those driven by short-term emotion, social pressure, or distraction, because your brain is under continuous low-level cognitive strain. But when you remove or significantly reduce those external inputs, you're not just creating peace and quiet, you're unburdening the nervous system. The sensory cortex isn't flooded with stimuli, which allows the prefrontal cortex to reclaim its full functional capacity. This means more working memory is available, more cognitive flexibility is possible, and you're better able to simulate potential outcomes before acting. That ability, mental simulation of future consequences, is one of the defining features of high-level decision-making, and it requires uninterrupted focus to fully engage. From a neurochemical perspective, reducing input also modulates dopaminergic activity. External stimuli, especially novel or emotionally charged ones, tend to spike dopamine in unpredictable ways, creating scattered attention and fragmented thinking. When the external noise drops, dopamine tone stabilizes, making the brain less compulsive and more intentional. This allows for sustained attention, better evaluation of trade-offs, and decisions that are based on internal logic rather than reactive emotion. In essence, reducing external input recalibrates the balance between bottom-up sensory processing and top-down cognitive control. You're no longer driven by what enters your field of awareness. You start driving your attention based on what truly matters. This shift isn't abstract or philosophical. It's a direct physical change in how your neural circuits prioritize information. By managing your inputs, you are literally improving the quality of your outputs, one decision at a time. When we engage in solitude with a specific goal, whether it's learning a skill, writing, training, or even structured reflection, we're not just isolating ourselves from distraction, we're activating a very specific neurochemical and circuit-based process in the brain that enhances motivation and deepens focus. Goal-directed behavior, in general, engages the mesolimbic dopamine system, particularly the ventral tegmental area, VTA, and nucleus accumbens. These regions are part of what's often called the brain's reward pathway. But this reward system isn't just about receiving pleasure after achieving a goal. It's more fundamentally about mountain pursuit, the anticipation and sustained effort toward a meaningful target. That's where dopamine comes in. Dopamine is not merely a feel-good molecule. It's a molecule of effort and persistence spent. When you're alone and focused on a single task with clear intent, unique happens. Because there are no competing social stimuli or multitasking demands, your attentional circuits narrow in. This narrowed focus, combined with meaningful effort, causes dopamine to be released in a contingent and when task-linked manner. In other words, the brain starts associating the steps of progress with internal chemical reinforcement. That reinforcement deepens learning, sharpens motivation, and increases the likelihood that you'll return to the task again. It becomes self-reinforcing. Solitude plays a key role here because it limits the external randomness that can cause dopamine dysregulation. For example, social media or constant interaction with others creates unpredictable dopamine spikes, likes, messages, stimulation, that train the brain to seek novelty instead of depth. But in solitude, especially when it's tied to a personal or intellectual challenge, dopamine is released in a more unpredictable, controllable pattern, and it's essential for developing long-term drive. There's also a neuroanatomical shift that occurs. When you're deeply engaged in goal-directed solitude, the prefrontal cortex begins to work, in tighter coordination with the basal ganglia, a structure involved in habit formation and action selection. This alignment facilitates a feedback loop. The more you focus and make progress, the more dopamine is released. The more dopamine is released, the more focused and motivated you become. That's the biological foundation of what people often call in flow. But it's not mystical, it's mechanistic. Furthermore, sustained solitary effort on a meaningful task enhances synaptic plasticity, especially in the hippocampus and cortical areas related to the skill or knowledge domain you're working on. That plasticity, essentially the brain's ability to change and wire itself, is amplified by dopamine. Without that chemical engagement, learning is shallow and fleeting. With it, you create lasting neural changes that make skills feel more natural, intuitive, and rewarding over time. So the act of choosing solitude isn't passive. It's active neurochemical training. You're teaching your brain to link pleasure and purpose, to reinforce depth over distraction, and to build internal pathways that support long-range thinking, consistency, and resilience. You're not escaping the world. You're reorganizing your nervous system to engage with it better. And in a time when attention is fragmented and reward is constantly outsourced, that kind of internal alignment isn't just beneficial, it's revolutionary. Silence has a measurable and direct impact on the regulation of cortisol, the primary stress hormone released by the adrenal glands in response to perceived threats or pressure. Cortisol is essential for survival in acute situations. It helps mobilize energy, sharpens focus, and enhances short-term immune function. But chronic elevation of cortisol, which is often driven by ongoing exposure to noise, distraction, and emotional overstimulation, has profoundly negative effects on both mental and physical health. What we know from neuroendocrinology and psychophysiology is that the body interprets environmental noise and overstimulation not just as sensory events, but as potential stressors. When auditory stimuli, especially unpredictable, high-volume, or emotionally triggering ones, are processed by, where the brain, they engage the amygdala, the region responsible for detecting threats and coordinating the stress response. This triggers activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis, which then leads to the release of cortisol into the bloodstream. Persistent exposure to even low-grade noise, like background conversation, digital alerts, or traffic, keeps this system in a subtle but continuous state of activation. Over time, this reduces your ability to return to baseline, meaning the body remains in a reactive, elevated cortisol state even in the absence of true threat. This impacts sleep, mood stability, immune function, and cognitive clarity. Silence, on the other hand, acts as a regulatory intervention. It reduces sensory input, especially from the auditory system, which leads to decreased activation of the amygdala and helps quiet the HPA axis. With reduced threat signaling, cortisol secretion begins to taper off. Importantly, this doesn't just happen during extended silent retreats or meditative practice. Even short periods, 2 to 5 minutes, of intentional silence can begin to downshift the nervous system toward parasympathetic dominance, the rest and digest mode governed by the vagus nerve. That shift has a cascade of beneficial effects. Heart rate variability increases, indicating improved emotional flexibility and resilience. Breathing becomes slower and deeper, reinforcing vagal tone, which in turn supports better regulation of the limbic system. This matters because the limbic system is where emotional salience is processed. When it is dysregulated by chronic stress, people become more reactive, less reflective, and more prone to impulsive or defensive behavior. When silence becomes a consistent practice, meaning you deliberately create spaces each day to reduce input, it trains the nervous system to become less sensitized to external triggers. You begin to create a kind of emotional buffer. You're no longer lurching from one stimulus to the next. You're giving your system the opportunity to recalibrate. This creates room for better decision-making, less emotional volatility, and a stronger baseline of calm. What's more, there's an interplay here between neurobiology and neuroplasticity. Emotional regulation isn't just a personality trait, it's a trainable skill that reflects the structure and function of the brain. With regular exposure to silence and lowered cortisol levels, the prefrontal cortex becomes more capable of exerting top-down control over the amygdala. This improves your ability to reframe thoughts, pause before reacting, and recover more quickly from stress, all indicators of emotional regulation at the biological level. So the impact of silence is not subtle or abstract. It creates real changes in hormone levels, neural connectivity, and emotional capacity. It interrupts the stress loop, gives the nervous system room to breathe, and builds the internal architecture for calm, clarity, and controlled responses. In a world that thrives on speed and stimulation, silence is not the absence of action. It's a strategic input that restores balance and resilience from the inside out. Focusing inward, deliberately turning attention toward your internal state, activates and strengthens the brain's interoceptive network, which is responsible for sensing and interpreting signals from within the body. These are signals like your heartbeat, your breath, muscle tension, hunger, fatigue, and even subtle shifts in emotional tone. Interoception isn't just about noticing bodily sensations. It's about the brain learning to map the internal landscape of the body in real time. This internal awareness plays a fundamental role in self-regulation, emotional stability, and cognitive control. From a neuroscience standpoint, the key structures involved in interoception include the insular cortex, anterior cingulate cortex, and somatosensory cortices. These areas receive and integrate sensory information coming from inside the body via the vagus nerve and spinal pathways. When you focus inward through practices like breath awareness, heartbeat tracking, body scans, or even moment-to-moment tension awareness, you increase the activity in these circuits. Over time, this repeated engagement leads to greater sensitivity and accuracy in detecting internal cues, a phenomenon referred to as enhanced interoceptive accuracy. This matters because the nervous system doesn't just respond to external threats or rewards, it also responds to the interpretation of internal states. For example, the difference between experiencing anxiety and labeling it accurately as a temporary surge in sympathetic activation comes down to the brain's capacity for interoception. When the brain can identify and contextualize internal signals correctly, the emotional response becomes regulated instead of reactive. That's a huge shift. It changes your ability to manage stress, control impulses, and make grounded decisions under pressure. There's also a direct connection between interoception and the regulation of autonomic functions like heart rate, respiration, and digestion. When you train yourself to become aware of your breath or your heart rhythm, you're not just passively observing, you're gaining partial control over systems that are typically automatic. This is one reason breathwork and slow, conscious breathing have been shown to lower heart rate, increase heart rate variability, and reduce sympathetic nervous system dominance. You're influencing the body from the inside out, but doing it by training the brain to listen better. In terms of plasticity, the more time you spend tuning into internal cues, the more responsive and precise the interoceptive system becomes. This has downstream effects on mental clarity, emotional resilience, and even creativity. People often overlook this because interoception doesn't feel loud or dramatic. It feels quiet, often subtle. But that's exactly why it's powerful. It offers the brain a stable internal anchor in a world full of volatile external inputs. There's also evidence that individuals with stronger interoceptive awareness have greater access to emotional intelligence, meaning they can identify, label, and regulate their own emotional states more effectively. They're also better able to detect shifts in mood or energy before they become overwhelming, giving them more opportunity to respond rather than react. This isn't a personality trait. It's a trainable, measurable skill grounded in neural architecture. So focusing inward isn't about withdrawing from the world. It's about refining the instrument through which you engage with it. It's about building a more nuanced internal feedback system that improves your ability to manage stress, sustain attention, recover from setbacks, and maintain physical and emotional homeostasis. You're teaching the brain to listen more closely to the body, and in doing so, you're creating a more resilient, adaptive, and self-aware version of yourself. One that's built not through external validation, but through internal mastery. Minimizing speech, choosing not to express every thought, reaction, or opinion, has a direct impact on how the brain manages impulse control. At first glance, it might seem like speech and impulse control are unrelated, but from a neurobiological perspective, they are deeply connected through shared circuits in the prefrontal cortex, basal ganglia, and anterior cingulate cortex, which govern inhibition, restraint, and the suppression of premature responses. Every time you feel the urge to speak and choose not to, especially in emotionally charged situations, you are engaging inhibitory control. This process recruits the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for executive function and top-down regulation. In simpler terms, this region allows you to override immediate impulses in favor of longer-term goals or contextually appropriate behavior. When you practice restraint, when you feel the impulse to react verbally and instead pause, you are reinforcing these circuits in real time. This practice is similar in principle to delaying gratification or resisting temptation. It activates and strengthens neural pathways associated with patience, discernment, and the ability to tolerate discomfort without needing to relieve it immediately through expression. Over time, this creates a kind of a braking system in the brain, a refined ability to pause, assess, and choose action based on logic and internal alignment rather than emotional momentum. Neuroscience tells us that the brain is plastic. It changes with repetition and intention. So when you minimize speech not as a form of suppression, but as a conscious discipline, you're reshaping the networks that control your reactivity. You're teaching the brain that not every stimulus demands an immediate output. This has profound implications for both emotional regulation and cognitive clarity. People who constantly verbalize their thoughts tend to reinforce a loop of impulsivity. They're reacting to stimuli before giving their internal systems time to process or prioritize. But individuals who train themselves to hold space before speaking activate a fundamentally different mode of operation, one grounded in metacognition and self-monitoring. There's also a deeper energetic and attentional aspect to this. Every time you speak, you're not just emitting sound. You're using cognitive energy to form language, predict reactions, and adjust your communication in real time. This consumes working memory, taxes the attentional systems, and limits your capacity for deeper thought. By reducing speech, especially in unnecessary or non-constructive contexts, you conserve this energy and redirect it inward. This doesn't mean becoming socially withdrawn. It means using speech with precision and intention rather than as a reflex or habit. Moreover, when you stop constantly explaining yourself, defending yourself, or narrating your every move, you reduce what cognitive science refers to as self-referential processing. This is the internal loop where we mentally rehearse how others might perceive us or respond to our actions. Reducing verbal output decreases this loop's intensity, which can lead to lower levels of anxiety, less compulsive thought, and a more stable sense of identity that isn't shaped by external feedback in real time. Minimizing speech is also a gateway to developing better observational skills. The brain can only focus on a limited number of inputs at any given time. When you're talking, you're typically focused on output. But when you're silent, your perceptual systems, especially auditory and visual processing, become more active and fine-tuned. You start noticing details, patterns, and emotional undercurrents in others that you might miss when you're dominating the interaction. This increases social awareness, empathy, and pattern recognition, all of which are high-level cognitive functions. From a behavioral standpoint, this discipline can translate to other areas of life. Individuals who practice verbal restraint often report increased ability to delay gratification in eating, spending, and emotional reactivity. That's because impulse control is a generalized capacity. When you strengthen it in one domain, it spills over into others. The skill of not interrupting someone, of not responding to provocation, or of holding back a comment until it's truly necessary isn't trivial. It's neural training in restraint, patience, and emotional sovereignty. In the long term, this creates a person who not only thinks more clearly, but acts more deliberately. And that kind of person tends to have greater impact, not because they're louder, but because when they do speak, people listen. The speech carries weight because it is rare, intentional, and often informed by reflection rather than reaction. So minimizing speech isn't about silence for its own sake. It's about developing the cognitive and emotional infrastructure required to act, speak, and live with greater precision, integrity, and focus. Isolation of attention, deliberately directing focus toward one task, one goal, or one area of improvement while excluding all competing stimuli, is not just a productivity tactic. It's a fundamental neurological principle that underlies the development of mastery. When the brain isolates a specific domain of attention, it activates a highly specialized set of neural mechanisms that enhance plasticity, deepen learning, and reorganize internal circuitry to favor long-term performance improvements. Let's break this down from a neurobiological perspective. At the core of attention isolation is the interaction between the prefrontal cortex and the sensory systems, particularly the visual and somatosensory cortices, and the dopaminergic reward system. The prefrontal cortex is the region responsible for top-down control, which means it governs how the brain filters incoming information, sets priorities, and sustains effort in a specific direction. When you isolate your attention, meaning you commit to focusing on one thing without deviation, you activate the prefrontal cortex to suppress irrelevant stimuli and amplify signals that align with the chosen task. This selective filtering isn't just about willpower or discipline. It has a physical representation in the brain. The neurons involved in the attended task begin to fire more frequently and synchronously. Over time, this repeated activation leads to the strengthening of synaptic connections, a process called long-term potentiation. In other words, the circuits involved in the skill you're trying to master become more efficient, faster, and more deeply embedded into the architecture of your brain. Now, this is where plasticity enters the conversation. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on experience, isn't something that happens equally across all activities. It's gated, meaning the brain decides when and where to change itself based on specific internal conditions. One of those gating mechanisms is focused attention. Unless the brain perceives that a task is important and that attention is being fully allocated to it, it doesn't open the gate for plastic change. So when you isolate your attention, you're not just increasing learning speed, you're creating the biological conditions necessary for learning to happen at all. There's also a crucial role played by the neuromodulator acetylcholine, which is released from the basal forebrain during states of intense focus. Acetylcholine acts like a spotlight in the brain. It marks certain synapses for change and helps tag information as relevant. This means the content you're attending to gets prioritized for consolidation in memory and skill circuits. Without this kind of focus, learning becomes shallow, fragmented, and difficult to retain. So attention isolation isn't optional for mastery. It's the only path to meaningful, lasting change at the cellular level. Another key player here is dopamine, which is involved in motivation, pursuit, and reinforcement. When you focus deeply on a task and begin making progress, even small wins, the brain releases dopamine in response. This dopamine doesn't just make you feel good. It increases the likelihood that you'll return to the task again. It creates a loop. Effort leads to reward. Reward reinforces effort, and the cycle continues. This is how habits of excellence are formed, not by occasional bursts of inspiration, but by repeated engagement with a single focus that becomes intrinsically rewarding over time. Multitasking, by contrast, destroys this loop. Every time attention shifts from one task to another, the brain pays a metabolic cost. It takes time and energy to reorient circuits, disengage from one focus, and activate another. Even small frequent shifts, checking a phone, responding to a notification, mentally switching topics, can disrupt dopamine's contingent release and break the reward-effort association. Over time, this leads to fragmented learning, diminished performance, and chronic cognitive fatigue. The brain becomes wired for distraction rather than depth. The process of mastery, whether it's in sports, writing, scientific inquiry, or any high-skill domain, demands what we might call a neural saturation. That means saturating the brain's working memory and attentional networks with one mode of input for long enough that structural and functional changes can take place. This only happens through isolation of attention. It's not about being busy, it's about being absorbed. It's about letting the brain immerse so deeply in a task that it begins to self-organize around that task, to prune away irrelevant circuitry, and to build new pathways dedicated to performance in that domain. Even more powerful is what happens over time with this kind of practice. The brain begins to predict what's coming next. Prediction is the hallmark of expertise. When you focus long enough on a skill, your nervous system doesn't just respond to input, it anticipates it. This is seen in elite performers of all kinds. Their brains fire in advance of their actions. That anticipatory capacity comes only from deep, prolonged focus, and it's what separates high performers from average ones. And again, this doesn't happen through scattered attention or divided focus. It happens only through repeated isolation of attention over extended periods. In a culture obsessed with speed and multitasking, attention isolation is increasingly rare, but that's also why it's so powerful. It gives you an edge, not because it's trendy, but because it's rooted in how the brain actually works. You're training your brain to change itself, structurally, chemically, and functionally, in alignment with your goals. You're not just learning faster, you're becoming someone who learns differently. Mastery in this context isn't a finish line, it's a neurological evolution brought about by a decision to focus on one thing until the brain begins to build itself around that pursuit. That's not metaphor, it's measurable, and it's how lasting greatness is built.